The most controlled character in television made decisions that completely contradicted everything he had proven himself to be. For over 20 years of screen time spanning his history, this character demonstrated a singular behavioral pattern that separated him from every other antagonist in the story, which was the absolute subordination of personal emotion to strategic advantage, meaning that while other characters acted on impulse or pride or immediate gratification, he constructed elaborate systems that allowed him to pursue his true goals while maintaining complete deniability and invisibility. Yet in his final arc, this same character abandoned every principle that had kept him alive and began making choices that a street-level criminal would recognize as fatal, which creates a fundamental question about whether the ending served the character or simply served the dramatic requirements of visual storytelling. Spoilers ahead. What made this character's version of control fundamentally different from simple caution or cowardice was that his patience wasn't defensive but offensive, meaning he didn't avoid conflict because he feared it but because he understood that survival in his world required the total absence of visible connection to violence, which is why he built an entire legitimate business infrastructure that generated real value and employed real people and contributed to the actual economy, not as a cover story but as a primary vessel through which he could execute long-term strategies that would eventually deliver what he actually wanted. And this distinction matters because it reveals that his public mask wasn't a disguise hiding his true self, but rather the method through which his true self operated most effectively. The friendly restaurant manager who smiled at customers and maintained health code standards and participated in community events wasn't performance covering a criminal. It was a delivery system for a form of revenge so patient and so systematic that it required decades of absolute discipline. And every polite interaction and every charitable donation and every health inspection served the singular purpose of remaining so thoroughly invisible that when the final move came, no one would ever trace it back to him. The hidden engine that powered every calculated move across all those years was a specific wound that occurred in his past, a loss so profound that it fundamentally reorganized his entire psychology around a single destination, which was the complete destruction of the people responsible. But the critical detail that defined his character was that this revenge could never be the method, only the destination, meaning that while other characters might have immediately pursued violent retaliation, he understood that immediate satisfaction would guarantee immediate death. So instead, he constructed a 20-year infrastructure that generated hundreds of millions of dollars and employed hundreds of people and created legitimate economic value, specifically so that when the moment finally arrived, he would have resources and positioning that made him untouchable. This is what made him more dangerous than impulsive villains who acted on emotion. His emotion was just as intense, but it was filtered through a system that converted rage into patience and patience into power and power into the ability to eventually execute vengeance from a position of complete safety. And for 2 decades of narrative time, he never once deviated from this pattern, which is why his final choices represent such a fundamental departure from established psychological truth. The first crack in his control framework appeared when he began choosing visibility over invisibility and personal involvement over systematic distance, which marked a complete reversal of everything his behavior had demonstrated for 20 years. And the specific moment this shift occurred was when his pride in his own invincibility started to override his understanding that invincibility required never being seen as a threat. For a character who had survived decades in an industry with a mortality rate approaching 100% by maintaining absolute separation between his public identity and his private operations, the decision to personally confront threats and to believe that his reputation alone could protect him represented a fundamental misunderstanding of what had actually kept him alive, which was not his fearsome reputation but a complete absence of a fearsome reputation in any context that mattered to law enforcement or rival organizations. The story needed this shift because it needed to move toward visual confrontation and explosive conclusion, but the shift itself contradicted the behavioral evidence that the character had spent years establishing. And this is where the narrative prioritized dramatic satisfaction over psychological consistency. The cascading errors that followed this initial crack each moved further from the logic that had defined him, and the most glaring example was the nursing home decision, which represented a choice that the character who existed for 20 years of screen time would have recognized immediately as fatal because it required personal presence at a scene of violence. It created direct, evidentiary connection between himself and a criminal act. It relied on the assumption that a single spectacular, move could substitute for systematic infrastructure, and it completely abandoned the principle that had kept him alive for decades, which was that safety comes from never being in the room when consequences occur. A character who had built his entire survival strategy on maintaining layers of separation between himself and violence, who had created elaborate systems specifically so that he could execute his will through intermediaries while remaining completely removed from any scene that might later be investigated, would not suddenly decide that personal attendance at a murder was the optimal strategy, because everything in his established psychology pointed toward a different response, which was to outlive the threat through the same patient infrastructure that had served him for 20 years rather than confront it through direct action that exposed him to immediate danger. The logically consistent alternative that fits the character's demonstrated psychology operates through three inevitable steps that each align with his established patterns rather than contradicting them. And the first step is the recognition that direct revenge, despite decades of building toward it, would destroy everything he had constructed, and would represent a failure to honor the very principles that had made revenge possible in the first place, which leads to a darker but more consistent choice, which is to abandon the immediate satisfaction of personal vengeance in favor of outliving the threat entirely, meaning that instead of confronting the danger, he would use the same meticulous infrastructure that built his empire to simply wait until the threat eliminated itself through its own chaos, or until he could dismantle it through methods that maintained his complete invisibility. The second step follows naturally from this choice, which is a deployment of the same systematic patience that characterized his entire arc, meaning that he would identify the threat's vulnerabilities not through direct engagement but through observation and analysis, and he would use intermediaries in infrastructure and financial pressure and legal mechanisms and every other tool that kept him safe for 20 years. Because the character who built a multinational distribution network through patience and planning wouldn't suddenly abandon that methodology in favor of personal confrontation when the stakes were highest. The third step is the inevitable outcome where control wins but personal satisfaction remains forever delayed, which means he survives and his empire survives and the threat eventually dissolves, but he never gets a direct revenge that his hidden engine has craved for decades. And this creates an ending that is psychologically darker than the explosive spectacle we receive because it asks whether someone who has disciplined themselves for 20 years to prioritize survival over satisfaction can ever actually achieve satisfaction, or whether the very discipline that made them successful has permanently severed their ability to experience the emotional resolution they've been building toward. And this alternative fits who he demonstrated himself to be, even though it denies both the character and the audience a cathartic release that the actual ending provided. The second step follows naturally from this choice, which is a deployment of the same systematic patience that characterizes his entire arc, meaning that he would identify the threat's vulnerabilities not through direct engagement but through observation and analysis, and he would use intermediaries in infrastructure and financial pressure and legal mechanisms and every other tool that kept him safe for 20 years. Because the character who built a multinational distribution network through patience and planning wouldn't suddenly abandon that methodology in favor of personal confrontation when the stakes were highest. The story chose drama over consistency because television operates under different requirements than pure character logic, meaning that an audience expects visual spectacle and explosive confrontation and definitive conclusions, especially in the final acts of a narrative. And a character who simply outlives his problems through patient infrastructure doesn't deliver the same emotional impact as a character who walks into a confrontation and creates a visually spectacular exit. But this choice represents the eternal tension in storytelling between what satisfies an audience and what honors the psychological truth of a character who has been defined by specific behavioral patterns for years. The narrative needed an ending that felt complete and provided visual excitement and delivered cathartic release. But the character's established psychology pointed toward an ending where control trumped emotion even when emotion has been a hidden engine for decades, and these two requirements cannot be reconciled without sacrificing one or the other, which is why the ending we received served the dramatic needs of the story while contradicting the psychological consistency of the character. If you build your life on control and then abandon it for emotion, you're not being true to yourself. You're becoming the thing you spent decades proving you weren't.